In the arid heart of southern Peru, where the Andes whisper to the Pacific and the earth drinks the sun with no relief, there lies a vast and silent plain, the Pampa Colorada. A land of flame-colored soil and cobalt skies, where the wind carries no voices, only the breath of ages past. Here, beneath a merciless sun and skies of eternal blue, an ancient people carved their message into the bones of the earth, not with words, but with lines, shapes, and creatures so vast they can only be truly seen from the heavens. This is where the story begins. From the air, the lines of Naska stretch across the desert like forgotten veins of a titan, etched not by modern hands, but by a civilization that flourished before the Incas, before the Spanish, even before the clouds of modern history began to gather. Spiders the length of football fields, monkeys with curling tails, and birds with wingspans rivaling jet planes. Straight lines running arrow-straight for miles, and trapezoids like pathways for gods. Who made these? Why? And how, in a place so desolate that even time seems to falter? Their name was Naska. A people both shrouded in mystery and immortalized by their monumental artistry, born in the fertile river valleys that streaked through the desert like lifelines. They emerged not with a roar, but with the patience of irrigation, with clay turned to beauty, with textiles spun tighter than the finest Roman silks, and with the will to turn barren earth into a canvas of cosmic meaning. It is said that when the gods flew overhead, they looked down and saw reflections of themselves. The lines were not just for humans. They were whispers to the divine. Around 200 BCE, as Rome battled Carthage and Han emperors ruled the East, in this far corner of the world, a different kind of greatness stirred. No pyramids rose. No bronze swords clashed. And yet a different legacy was born, one of geomancy and spirit, of ritual and vast silence. The Naska did not build to be seen. They built to be understood from above. Under a sky that has not changed in 2,000 years, on lands where rain rarely falls and footprints last centuries, the Naska called to the stars. And the stars may have answered. This is their tale. Told in 6 acts, like the lines they drew, beginning with origins buried in the dust, rising through culture and faith, sharpened by war and survival, and ending in legacy still etched on desert skin. This is the story of the people who drew on the wind's skin. The land of the Naska was not merely desolate. It was deliberate. The high desert plateau, bounded by the narrow strips of river valleys and the rising fingers of the Andes, forged a crucible for survival. With less than an inch of rainfall per year, it would seem an unlikely place for civilization. But that is where greatness often lies, not in the fertile, but in the formidable. In the deep ochre of the Pampa, where no forest cloaks the horizon and no mountain provides shelter, the people of Naska developed a bond not of dominance over nature, but of cooperation. They traced its rhythms. They studied the sky, the shadows, the shifting winds. From this communion, their art emerged. Not as mere ornament, but as invocation. When a Naska priest traced the outline of a hummingbird into the desert floor, he was not creating. He was unveiling. These forms, some believe, were maps of water. Others say they were calendars, aligned with the rising of stars and solstices. Some see ritual runways for shamans who dance the paths into trance, their feet stirring not dust, but power. There are more than 800 straight lines, some stretching over 10 miles. More than 70 biomorphs, living shapes, birds, whales, lizards, and men. And hundreds of geometric forms, trapezoids, spirals, zigzags. From the sky, they whisper meaning. From the ground, they defy logic. The technique was astonishing in its simplicity. With no machines, no aerial view, they removed the top layer of iron oxide pebbles, revealing the lighter soil beneath. The dryness preserved the contrast. The wind, in its strange grace, did not disturb them. The desert became their scroll, and the sun their ink. But the lines are not the beginning. They are the message left after centuries of learning, the final verse, not the first. Before they drew in the sand, the Naska cultivated life where death was law. Their fields of maize and beans, their networks of underground aqueducts, pukios, their ceramics, colored with iron reds and deep blacks, told of a society that had not merely survived the desert, but understood it. A people who listened to silence. A people who spoke in lines. The Naska believed the world was layered, this realm, the world below, and the skies above. Their shamans drank the San Pedro cactus and spoke with spirits. They bled for visions. Their art showed gods with serpentine tongues, and beings whose limbs were both wings and roots. They carved them into goods, wove them into cloth, painted them on pots. But only on the desert did they draw them large enough for the heavens to see. To walk the Naska plain is to step beyond the realm of ordinary time. The sky above is too vast. The silence is too deep. There are no trees, no shadows, no horizon that does not shimmer in the heat. Only the lines, the wind, and the stones, each of them older than memory. And yet, the Naska did not build for beauty alone. They built for alignment. The lines are not random, they are coded with meaning. Some run directly toward the rising or setting sun during solstices. Others echo the outlines of underground water sources, veins of life beneath the sand. Their placement suggests a mind attuned to the cosmos, a society whose architects watched both stars and roots. To the Naska, the earth was not dead. It was alive, sacred, Pachamama, the mother world. And to honor her, they did not raise monuments, but gently traced her skin with ritual purpose. They did not sculpt upward to challenge the heavens. They etched downward to commune with the world that had given them breath. The great bird glyphs, the condor, the hummingbird, the heron, were not mere animals. They were messengers, spirits in motion, captured in eternal flight across the desert. The whale and the monkey, creatures from distant coastal jungles, appeared here too, suggesting the Naska held visions not bound by geography. The land itself became their vision field, an open canvas for the soul's journey. And in the center of it all, silence. The desert has no voice. That is what made it sacred. Some scholars believe the lines were paths of pilgrimage. Walked slowly, reverently, in trance. Shamans would drink the hallucinogenic brew made from the San Pedro cactus, then step into the geoglyphs barefoot. Each footstep a word. Each spiral a question. Each zigzag a prayer. Others see them as communal projects, an act of unification. 1,000 hands clearing the soil. 1,000 people, working not for wealth, not for empire, but for meaning. This was not a city-building culture. They did not raise pyramids to dwarf man beneath God. They lived in small, dispersed communities, Kawachi among them, the ceremonial center, the heart of belief. No written language. No armies. And yet, the lines endure, while empires have crumbled to dust. Perhaps that is their genius. Their gods did not demand sacrifice upon stone altars, but reverence written in light and dust. Their calendar was not of papyrus or clay, but made of stars and wind and line. In the Pampa Colorada, no battles were fought. No palaces rose. And yet this land holds power. You can feel it. The way the air changes when you step across a glyph. The way the stones resist being moved, as if held in place by memory. What kind of people leave behind no tombs of kings, no epic conquests, only drawings so vast they defy the scale of human ego? What kind of mind, 2,000 years ago, could see a monkey dancing in a spiral from the ground? The answer lies not in what the Naska built, but in how they looked. At earth. At sky. At time. Theirs was not a culture of dominion. It was a culture of resonance. They walked the desert with reverence, as if each footfall stirred something beneath, a spirit, a memory, a buried fire. And though their temples were humble, though their names have not survived in stone, the Naska left behind something far more enduring, intention. Each glyph was an invocation. To the untrained eye, the lines seem simple. Yet when traced, they do not wander. They do not hesitate. They move with purpose. A line stretches over hills and across gullies, never breaking, never deviating, as though it were guided by something beyond sight. And perhaps it was. Imagine the builders. No towers to view their progress. No flying machines to oversee their art. Just ropes, stakes, and will. Yet they carved images of such precision and scale that only the gods could fully behold them. This was more than geometry. This was devotion. And what of the people who carried out the labor? They were farmers, artisans, priests, not slaves, not conscripts. The creation of the lines appears to have been voluntary, ritual, collective. A people united not by kingship, but by vision. By belief. By sky. The desert itself became holy. But holiness, like the desert, is fragile. Occasionally, the Naska plains are visited by the Wacos, sudden, violent floods that crash down from the mountains, sweeping boulders, trees, and entire sections of land into oblivion. In a land so dry that rain is myth, the deluge is a shock, a punishment or a blessing, depending on your prayers. Some believe the Naska lines were made, in part, to ask the gods for mercy, for water, for balance. The trapezoids may be paths for rain to find its way. The spirals a call for cycles to return. The birds, perhaps, symbols of fertility, not only of wombs, but of rivers and fields. Everything was a message. Everything had meaning. And perhaps the most powerful message was this: in a world that gives so little, create. The Naska did not fight wars to defend empires. They fought the sand, the drought, the silence. And they did not merely survive. They engraved their faith into the very bones of the earth. Today, when satellites pass overhead and capture those ancient shapes, we marvel. But what we see is only the echo. The original voice was never meant for us. It was meant for the sky. To stand upon the Pampa is to feel small, not diminished, but humbled. The lines are not there to be understood quickly. They are there to outlast you. To remind you that even in the driest of lands, a civilization once rose not with weapons, but with wonder. And though their towns faded, and their names were forgotten, they remain silent architects of the sky's mirror. For theirs was not a history of conquest. It was a history of question. And across 2 millennia of wind and silence, the questions remain. And so they watched the heavens. Long before telescopes, long before compasses or sextants, the Naska stood beneath the unyielding dome of stars and memorized their dance. The desert, devoid of trees and clouds, gave them a perfect observatory, a mirror of the cosmos etched into the earth itself. They watched Orion rise. They traced the Pleiades. They saw Venus shimmer like a god's eye over the western horizon. It was not superstition. It was attention. The same attention that allowed them to guide lines over uneven terrain with uncanny accuracy. The same attention that led them to plant according to the rhythms of stars and solstices. To them, the sky was not apart from the earth. It was part of it, inverted and divine. Each line, then, was not just a glyph. It was a bridge. A bridge between soil and starlight. Between human longing and celestial rhythm. Some say the Naska believed their gods dwelled in the mountains, the Apis, ancient spirits who controlled rain, fertility, death. Others say their gods were the stars themselves, peering down to read what had been drawn for them. Still others believe the lines were sacred roots, walked in solemn procession to evoke trance, union, transformation. And still today, no consensus exists. The true purpose remains as elusive as the desert wind. But perhaps that is the point. Because the lines were never meant to be explained. They were meant to be experienced. Walked. Felt. The Naska did not build pyramids because their monuments were not meant to be seen from below, they were meant to be seen from beyond. Their greatest works were not built upward, but outward. Not to shelter kings, but to awaken gods. And what does that say of a people? What does it mean to create art not for display, but for communion? They are one of the few civilizations whose masterpieces cannot be understood without changing perspective. Without rising above the ground. Without flight. And for over 1500 years, no one flew. The glyphs waited. The hummingbird slept in silence. The spider curled beneath the sand. The whale waited for sky eyes. Until one day in the 20th century, a pilot saw them. And the world remembered. But the world did not understand. Planes flew overhead. Cameras clicked. Theories multiplied. Scholars argued over calendars, rituals, aliens, astronomical alignments. But the desert remained unchanged. The lines remained unmoved. They did not yield their secrets. Because they were not secrets. They were songs. Songs in the language of dust and stone. Of patience. Of heat. And they were never lost. We were simply too loud to hear them. And yet, for all their silence, the Naska left echoes in everything they touched. In the ochre-painted ceramics, where warriors and mythic beasts coil across vessels meant not for war, but for offering. In the shimmering textiles, woven so tightly that threads still whisper after 2,000 years. In the Puquio's underground aqueducts twisting beneath desert rock like veins of civilization, delivering life drop by drop in a land of thirst. Even in their bones, stories remain. Isotopic studies reveal their diets: maize and beans, sweet potatoes, and fish. Their skulls bear signs of ritual trepanation, holes cut to relieve spirit or sickness, and healed over with time, with care. These were not savage people. These were healers, artists, sky readers. Their legacy is not carved in gold or boasted on imperial walls. It is found in the quiet mastery of their survival. In their refusal to dominate the land, choosing instead to harmonize with its fury and silence alike. And what of the people themselves? What did their eyes see? Children born into dust-colored villages, raised beneath a sky too blue to hold secrets. Men who walked miles barefoot to trace a god's path through the gravel. Women who spun stories into thread, dyeing them with cactus and cochineal. Shamans who spoke to the moon not in words, but in gesture, in movement, in sacrifice. They did not build legends of conquest. They built glyphs. They asked questions. What moves a people to spend generations drawing lines that cannot be seen? What kind of faith does that require? What kind of love? And perhaps that is the truth of the Naska. That they were not reaching up to heaven in hunger, they were drawing heaven downward. One spiral at a time. One condor. One monkey. One perfect, arrow-straight line that says, "We were here." We looked up. And we understood. In an age that celebrates noise and power, the Naska left silence and wonder. In a world obsessed with permanence, they made impermanence sacred. And so, the wind still blows over the Pampa. The stars still rise. The lines still hold. And though the Naska are gone, they have never truly vanished. For every time a satellite passes overhead, and every time a stranger looks down from the window of a plane and sees a hummingbird curled into the desert, a whisper rises. Not in words, but in the shape of something eternal. Long before the lines, before the spirals and birds took shape beneath the Peruvian sun, the roots of the Naska people wound deep into the fertile veins of the desert's edge. Their story begins not with sand, but with water, the rare, sacred water that spilled from the Andean peaks and traced its way down narrow valleys to vanish into the dry earth. It was in these valleys, the Rio Grande de Naska and its tributaries, that life clung, stubborn and ancient. The Naska were not the first. They inherited the bones of a people who came before, the Paracas. A civilization of weavers and mystics, the Paracas had already mastered the desert's rhythms by 600 BCE. Their necropolises, discovered beneath cliffs along the Pacific coast, held mummified bodies wrapped in textiles so fine they rival the silks of the East. Hair dyed bright red. Skulls elongated, not by mutation, but by intention. A sign of nobility. A reshaping of the self into something divine. And it was from these enigmatic ancestors that the Naska emerged, not as conquerors, but as evolution. Sometime around 100 to 200 BCE, as the Paracas culture declined, the Naska rose. Whether by absorption, transformation, or migration, the transition was not marked by fire or collapse. It was subtle. Like a new voice speaking with familiar words. In the earliest Naska settlements, places like Estaqueria, Los Molinos, and Carhuachi, archaeologists find a confluence of technologies. Pottery shifts from incised forms to painted polychromes. Burial customs evolve. The vibrant colors of Paracas cloth give way to Naska ceramics, adorned with mythic imagery, cat serpents, killer whales, decapitators. Their settlements were not cities in the imperial sense. They were ritual hubs, agricultural centers, and clusters of earth and reed, built not to last forever, but to endure through meaning. Carhuachi, the most sacred of these places, was not a city of stone. It was a ceremonial city, sprawling over 24 square kilometers. There, hundreds gathered for seasonal rituals, their lives tied to rain and sun and soil. The site includes more than 40 mounds, pyramidal platforms made of adobe brick. Among them, the Great Temple, an architectural heart, rising from dust like a prayer. No palaces. No fortresses. Only temples and tombs. Only echoes. The Naska did not live in Carhuachi permanently. It was not home, it was horizon. From this place, they watched the heavens. From this place, they buried their dead. And perhaps, from this place, they began to dream of the lines. But it was the land that shaped them first. The southern Peruvian coast is one of Earth's most extreme environments. The Atacama Desert begins here, one of the driest places in the world. Rains fall perhaps once in a generation. But paradoxically, the rivers that flow down from the Andes provide brief fertility. The valleys become oases, narrow strips of green winding through vast barrens of rock and dust. The Naska adapted. They dug canals. They built underground aqueducts, puquios, still in use today. Spiraled openings ventilated the tunnels, allowing workers to descend and clean them. These were not mere engineers. They were geologists, hydrologists, readers of the soil. Without their mastery of water, the desert would have consumed them. And the climate, like a sleeping jaguar, stirred often. El Niño, the warm current that shifts the balance of the Pacific, brought rain, too much rain every few decades. Torrents that carved gullies and destroyed crops. The rivers that had given life turned furious, devouring fields and burying entire settlements in mud. The Naska learned to build light, to rebuild often, and to anchor their hope not in permanence, but in pattern. They studied cycles. And in cycles, they saw gods. To the Naska, time was not a line. It was a circle. A return. A breathing in and breathing out of the world. Every flood, every drought, every eclipse, nothing was random. All was part of a divine dialogue between human and cosmos. And from this dialogue, their myths were born. Their gods were not distant tyrants. They were forces braided into nature itself. There was Kon, the bringer of rain and wind, a sky deity whose presence could bless or break. Some depictions show him as a beaked figure with serpentine appendages, neither fully human nor beast, but elemental. Others portray him with feline features, a fusion of jaguar and condor, claw and feather. Another being emerges repeatedly in Naska iconography, the decapitator. Part god, part priest, part warrior, it holds a severed head in one hand, a ceremonial blade in the other. This figure straddled realms, not a bringer of violence, but a guardian of cycles. The head was not trophy, but offering, a vessel of soul and transformation. In the Naska worldview, death fertilized life. Blood returned power to the earth. Some scholars connect these myths to the imagery on Naska ceramics, finely painted vessels bearing flying shamans, dual-headed serpents, and creatures with limb branches extending into wings. Others see in the iconography the story of agriculture itself, the sacrifice of seed to soil, the cutting down to bring rebirth. The Naska did not write their stories. They painted them. And in these images we glimpse a cosmology not of fear, but of balance. The river valleys they occupied, Ingenio, Naska, Adja, Tierras Blancas, each held its own cults, its own lineage, but all were woven together by shared symbols. Shared rituals. Shared necessity. The desert could not be tamed alone. It demanded unity. Their dwellings, made of adobe and cane, rose near their fields, compact, communal, and always close to water. Crops included maize, squash, beans, and cotton. Llamas were herded along ridgelines, and guinea pigs were raised within homes. The ocean, only a day's walk away, offered anchovies, shellfish, and dried marine delicacies that appeared in burials far inland. Burials themselves speak volumes. Children were sometimes interred with miniature tools. Women with weaving kits. Men with weapons, yes, but also with cups, gourds, and symbols of continuity. The dead were not abandoned. They were returned. And always, there were heads. Some were trophy heads, carefully prepared, mouths sewn shut, holes drilled in the forehead for cords. These were worn during rituals. Displayed. Passed down. But not as tokens of cruelty. They were sacred. Carriers of essence. Some scholars believe they were enemies, others think they were volunteers, sacrificial pilgrims. In either case, the message was clear: the spirit did not die. It transformed. So too did the culture. Over centuries, regional differences emerged, variations in ceramics, in burial style, in ritual architecture. The Naska were not a monolith. They were a tapestry. Threads drawn from Paracas roots, threaded through shifting sands and changing skies. And yet through it all, a coherence remained. A worldview shaped by extremity, and a spiritual tenacity that refused to break beneath sun or flood. It was in this crucible of ritual, environment, and inheritance that the idea of the lines was born. And yet, it was not merely nature that shaped the Naska, it was time. From the late initial period through the early intermediate, roughly 900 BCE to 600 CE, the Andes were a theater of shifting alliances, rising ceremonial centers, and embryonic kingdoms. In the highlands, the Chavin had long since waned, leaving behind iconography that rippled into distant valleys, fanged deities, feline-human hybrids, trance-bound priests. On the coast, cultures rose and fell like ocean tides. The Naska were never isolated. Though their valleys were enclosed by desert and mountains, their eyes were ever outward. Archaeological evidence shows connections to the Huari to the north, and trade goods from as far as the Amazon and the Altiplano. Spondylus shells from Ecuador. Turquoise. Cinnabar. Even traces of llama caravans carrying goods up and down ancient trails. But more than goods, ideas traveled. From the Paracas, they inherited not only artistic techniques, but a reverence for bodily transformation, cranial elongation, burial in the fetal position, wrapping the dead in layers of meaning. From their highland neighbors came metallurgy, simple at first, copper and gold foil, but imbued with symbolic weight. A glimmering nose ornament could speak of rank, or of connection to the sun. By 100 CE, the Naska style began to crystallize. This is the era known to archaeologists as Naska I through Naska IV, defined by distinctive ceramic forms and iconography. Pottery becomes more elaborate. Polychrome painting flourishes, red, black, white, yellow, violet. Images of animals, plants, and gods multiply. This was not mere decoration. Each vessel was a codex, a moving prayer. It is during this time that Kawachi becomes the spiritual heart of the culture. Though there were many settlements, Ventilla, La Muna, Tambo Vijo, Kawachi was unique. It grew not through conquest, but through convergence. People came from across the valleys to participate in rites, not only elites, but farmers, weavers, warriors, children. Pilgrims brought offerings, fine pottery, sacrificed cane lids, maize beer. They gathered before step platforms, climbed mud brick pyramids, watched priests in trance. And there, beneath that sky of liquid fire, they remembered who they were. Kawachi was not built for defense. There are no walls, no barracks, no royal palaces. Its function was sacred, symbolic, a node where the human and divine could meet. And when it fell out of use, sometime around 300 CE, it was not destroyed. It was ritually buried, sealed in dust, as if to return it to the earth from which it had been summoned. Around this time, the lines begin to appear. And perhaps now, we can begin to understand. The Naska were never interested in permanence of structure. They were interested in permanence of meaning. A pyramid can fall. A glyph carved in stone can be defaced. But a hummingbird the size of a stadium, etched into a plain where rain never falls? That endures. The first lines were simple, straight paths, crisscrossing the desert. Some archaeologists believe they were processional routes, leading from village to shrine, from puccio to sacred mound. But then came the shapes, the spider, the monkey, the tree, the man with radiant head. These are not random images. They reflect the Naska world in symbol. The spider, a creature of rain and patience. The monkey, from the humid jungle, a symbol of fertility, of balance. The killer whale, Otarango, master of sea and death. The radiant figure, perhaps a shaman, perhaps a god, arms raised in supplication. Every line was a petition. Every glyph, a vow. And they were made with astonishing precision. Stakes, ropes, simple tools, and yet the proportions hold across hundreds of meters. A trapezoid remains symmetrical across a hillside. A hummingbird's beak points exactly toward the winter solstice sunrise. These were not the works of spontaneous faith. They were the works of a civilization that had studied, recorded, remembered. But even the greatest glyphs begin in the smallest gestures. To create the geoglyphs, the Naska employed a deceptively simple technique. First, they would survey the land, flat, hard-packed desert with a dark, iron oxide crust. Then, they would scrape away this top layer, revealing the lighter yellowish clay beneath. The contrast was stark. A line appeared not because it was built up, but because it was removed. Negative space became sacred text. They used ropes and wooden stakes, carefully measured intervals, and sightlines aligned with stars or mountains. On-site discoveries of stake holes, still filled with fragments of twisted cord, confirm the method. This was no magical act. It was geometry. It was astronomy. It was art fused with science. It was knowledge passed down, not in books, but in hands. And it was this capacity for transgenerational memory that defined the Naska identity. Their ancestors had mapped the winds. These ones mapped meaning. Generations walked those same lines, not as tourists, not as scholars, but as pilgrims. Feet padding dust. Hearts attuned to rhythm. Each journey a retracing, a ritual of memory, of participation in the mythic landscape. And still, the lines were only one expression of their world. Across the valleys, evidence of complex irrigation systems reveals a people who understood hydrology as deeply as they did symbolism. Channels were dug with careful gradients, following natural contours. Stone-lined canals guided water from Andean runoff into fields of maize, quinoa, squash, and cotton. Terraces clung to hillsides, expanding arable land where none had existed. They did not conquer the desert. They seduced it. Meanwhile, craft specialization flourished. The finest Naska ceramics emerged during this time: bowls, effigy vessels, double spout and bridge jars. On them danced gods, animals, and mortals in vibrant red, black, and cream. Some were utilitarian. Others were reserved for elite ritual, smashed ceremonially after use, as if to release the spirit contained within. And the textiles, though few survive, those that do speak of virtuosity. Weaves tighter than modern machines can replicate. Abstract patterns beside sacred iconography. Tunics, mantles, belts, the Naska clothed themselves not just for function, but with philosophy. Nothing was meaningless. Nothing was accidental. Even body modification bore cosmological weight. Cranial deformation, achieved by binding an infant's head between boards, was practiced not out of cruelty, but symbolism. A lengthened skull was a mark of status, yes, but also of connection to the divine. It imitated the shape of maize, sacred food. It separated the ordinary from the initiated. And so, through skull and cloth, pigment and earth, the Naska inscribed themselves into their world, not as rulers of it, but as part of it. It was not a utopia. Evidence exists of internal conflict. Some burials bear signs of trauma. Others suggest stratification, elites buried with rich goods, commoners in simpler graves. Trophy heads, though spiritual, imply conflict or sacrifice. There was pain here, as in all civilizations. But it was a pain bound to purpose. A pain braided into meaning. The Naska understood the dual nature of the world, that creation and destruction dance together. That blood feeds the soil. That art and death are not opposites, but echoes. And this understanding shaped not only how they lived, but how they prepared to vanish. For by the late 5th century CE, change was coming. Environmental stress. El Niño events. River systems shifting. And new cultural influences rising from the highlands, most notably, the Wari. But even as their cities fell silent, the lines endured. The lines do not shout. They do not warn. They do not weep. They remain. Straight. Quiet. Timeless. And through them, the voices of those earliest dreamers, those who once walked from Kawachi to the desert's edge, who etched monkeys into the earth and prayers into the sky, are still speak. But time is never still. Even in the dry valleys of the Naska heartland, where the sun never blinks and the stones do not stir, history moves beneath the dust. By the late 400 CE, the signs of strain had begun to appear. The Naska valleys, long dependent on delicate irrigation networks and stable weather patterns, began to suffer. Tree ring and sediment analyses suggest a period of intensified El Niño cycles, years of excessive rain, then years of brutal drought. Fields flooded, then cracked. Rivers changed course. Aqueducts silted up. Ritual could not hold back the tide. In this climatic chaos, belief was tested. The lines, once symbols of cosmic harmony, may have become pleas. The trapezoids widened. The figures became more elaborate. Some archaeologists interpret this shift as a cultural response, a desperate prayer scaled up to divine proportions. When smaller offerings failed, the people made bigger ones. And amidst this, new influences arrived. From the highland city of Huari, or Huari, a new cultural wave swept through the southern Andes. Their architecture was modular, their administration hierarchical, their religion expansionist. Though the Naska were never directly conquered, the highland presence is felt in ceramics, in burial goods, in architectural techniques. It was not an invasion. It was a seepage. Kawachi, once the vibrant ritual center of the Naska, was abandoned, not suddenly, but deliberately. Structures were ritually filled in, sealed. Sacred spaces were buried beneath layers of earth, as if to close a chapter without violence. The people did not burn their temple. They put it to sleep. What followed was fragmentation. Smaller settlements rose, often fortified, higher up the valleys. Pottery became cruder, less colorful. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair. The great artistic flourish of Naska III and IV gave way to the pragmatic austerity of Naska V and VI. Some scholars call it decline. Others, transformation. For even in these twilight years, the cultural DNA of the Naska endured. The lines remained. New ones were added, perhaps by descendants who no longer remembered the original meanings, but still felt their power. The Puquio still flowed. Local rituals continued, now fused with highland deities and foreign motifs. The Naska did not disappear. They changed. And yet, beneath every adaptation, a continuity endured, the way a melody can still be heard even when the instruments change. A worldview shaped by drought and dreaming. A reverence for alignment. A refusal to erase. Centuries later, the Incas would rise. They would bring roads and taxes, armies, and record-keeping. But even they did not erase the Naska lines. Even they, it seems, sensed the weight of the earth's inscriptions. And then, centuries more, silence. Until the 1920s, when airplanes began flying over the southern Peruvian coast. Pilots, glancing down over what they thought was barren desert, saw something impossible, shapes. Perfect shapes. Shapes that should not exist without flight. Thus, in modernity, the Naska returned. Archaeologists arrived. Theories proliferated, astronomical calendars, religious paths, water maps, landing strips for gods. Maria Ricci, a German mathematician, devoted her life to their measurement and preservation. For decades, she walked the lines with compass and notebook, protecting them from erosion, vehicles, and ignorance. Thanks to her, the world listened. And finally, in 1994, UNESCO declared the Naska Lines a World Heritage Site. But this rediscovery, as miraculous as it is, brings risk. Tourists tread where no feet should fall. Vehicles, even a careless step, can scar the delicate desert. In 2018, a truck veered off a highway and carved deep ruts through ancient glyphs. In 2020, looters damaged parts of the site while searching for treasure. The irony is cruel. A people who created eternal messages are threatened by those who cannot listen. And yet, still, the lines remain. They outlasted flood and drought, empire and collapse. They may outlast us. Because in the end, the true origin of the Naska is not just in their settlements or their ceramics, their myths or their mummies. It is in their perspective. They saw earth and sky as one. They saw the human and divine as intertwined. They believed that meaning could be made, not through conquest or noise, but through alignment. And that belief, written in dust and light, is still legible today. And so, the Naska did not vanish. They flowed forward, like the very rivers they once tamed, narrowing, splitting, absorbed into greater currents. Their valleys grew quieter. Their rituals faded into new forms. Their temples crumbled beneath wind and time. But their voice, the voice they drew into the earth, still murmurs beneath the souls of those who walk the Pampa. Because a civilization is not only measured by its rise or its fall. It is measured by what it leaves behind. And the Naska left behind questions, symbols, silence, and lines that stretch toward forever. Now, to understand the soul of this people, to grasp what beat at the center of their long devotion, we must look not only at what they believed, but at what they made. The colors they summoned, the gods they painted, the visions they wore and drank and buried. It is time to walk among their creation. When the sun was high and the river valleys hummed with green, the Naska world bloomed, not upward into towers, but outward into craft. Their greatness was not a single monument, it was 1,000 perfected gestures, repeated until clay began to speak and thread turned to prayer. They built with hands, and the hands remembered. Across the Adja, Ingenio, and Naska valleys, morning smoke rose from kilns and kitchens alike, and the day's labor divided itself along the old devotions, to water, to earth, to color, to sound. You could follow the civilization by its textures, by the sheen of a burnished bowl, by the weight of a cotton mantle, by the polished edge of a good carved with serpents and flowers, by the slow breath of a subterranean wind rising from a Puccio spiral mouth. Clay that carried the gods. The Naska did not write on stone tablets, but their ceramics were libraries. Vessels with double spouts joined by an elegant bridge, stout bowls whose rims became stages for processions of myth, effigy jars where a god's beaked mass stared out across 2,000 years without blinking. Their painters worked in a disciplined riot of color, iron reds, chalk whites, soot blacks, warm yellows and purple browns, slips laid in careful layers before the fire fixed them forever. Lines were steady, curving boldly around bellies of clay, figures were crisp, their outlines so sure they seem inked by a single unbroken breath. Here marches the flying shaman, hair streaming like dark rain, hands lifted in trance. There coils the great killer whale, master of currents and depths, teeth bright, body ringed with symbols of power. Elsewhere, a procession of panpipes and dancers circles a step platform, their feet echoing rites we can only name by their shadows. Nothing is mere decoration. Every animal is a principle, every mask a cosmology. The spider is rain and patience, the hummingbird, miracle and precision, the monkey, fertility's smile from distant jungle heat. Even the so-called decapitator on a vessel's side is not horror, but cycle, the severed head as seed, life cut to live again. Firing demanded orchestras of timing. Potters tended updraft kilns and pits stoked with warango wood, watching the flares of flame, judging heat by color and sound. Too quick and the slip would blister, too cool and the pigments would sleep. They learned the median path where clay sings. Their failures fed their mastery fed the valley's soul. Textiles that remembered the wind. If clay preserved the myths, cloth carried them. Cotton from the river fields, lustrous, stubborn, generous, met came lid fiber from highland trade. Weavers, often women whose fingers moved with the economy of rain, set up backstrap looms under shade and drew patterns from memory, stepped mountains, serpent paths, bands of eyes, fields of birds whose wings were commas of prayer. Dyes came from earth and insect, plant and patience, deep reds from cochineal, yellows from chilka and mole, browns from clay and bark, blacks from iron-rich mud. There were mantles light as speech and tunics cut to hold the body like a soft argument with the sun. Belts, headbands, woven bags for coca and seed, each carried thought made tangible. The finest garments were more than status, they were portable altars. When a textile wrapped the dead, it wrapped promise. Feather work flickered at the edges, jungle birds impossible blues and greens arriving by caravan, stitched as borders of thunder around the throat of plain cotton. Nothing gaudy. Everything precise. Sound for the sacred. The valleys had music. Panpipes, antaras, carved from reed and bone, lashed in graduated ranks. Ensembles tuned not to our tempered ear but to wind, to chant, to footfall. Ceramic drums with taut skins, rattles of gourd and shell, conch trumpets that could unroll a sound like dawn over dry plain. In plaza ceremonies, lines of dancers moved in repeating patterns, their steps tracing echoes of the geoglyphs they would later walk in silence. Rhythm became geometry. Geometry, devotion. Water from the underworld. Below all this, below color and dance, ran water. Or rather, the stubborn search for it. The Puquios remain their quietest miracle, subterranean aqueducts driving into bone-dry hillsides, following seams where old rivers hide, tapping the earth's cool arteries. Spiral access shafts, those beautiful corkscrews of stone the locals still call ojos, let air circulate and workers descend with baskets and tools. Stone linings and warango timbers resisted collapse. Channels kept a gentle, exact grade so that flow never fell to turbulence. The system could be cleaned seasonally, repaired after floods, extended when fields begged for more. In a place where the sky rarely gives, the Naska taught the ground to answer. The Puquio mouth on a hot afternoon is a hymn in negative, heat everywhere, cool breath rising. Children peer down, hair ruffled by ancient engineering. In a world that measures genius by height, the Naska measured theirs by depth. Fields that fed faith. Irrigated terraces and lowland plots quilted the valleys, maize stood like small gold soldiers, beans threading nitrogen back into tired soil, squash sprawling their green arguments across adobe borders, chili peppers lifting lanterns of heat, cotton blooming into soft, harvestable clouds. Fruit trees, lucuma, guava, dotted garden edges, their shade a small mercy. Guinea pigs rustled in reed pens, llamas grazed on hills beyond the last irrigation canal. Farming was not separate from ritual. Planting began with songs and libations, chicha poured to earth, a modest sacrament to Pachamama. First harvests moved through plazas as offerings before they entered kitchens. What we might call agronomy, they called relationship. Roads, caravans, and the meeting of worlds. They were not an island. Paths stitched the desert to the sea to the Sierra to far horizons. Long before imperial highways gridded the Andes, footpaths and ridge trails carried footsteps and stories. Llama caravans rang like soft bells, bringing obsidian from highland flows, copper and gold foils, salt, chili, medicinal herbs, shells from warmer coasts, and the rare spondylus, thorny, orange, beautiful, whose color was rain and whose presence made altars sharp with far ocean. From valleys north and south came technologies and tastes. A stirrup spout silhouette glimpsed on a traded jar, a textile motif that folded highland geometry into coastal color, a good carved with a mountain god few had seen but many had dreamt. Trade was not conquest, it was a circulation of breath. At the shore, fishers slid reed craft into Pacific chop at dawn, returning with anchoveta and rockfish salted and sun-cured to travel inland. Inland, farmers packed cotton and painted pots for coastal shrines. The economy was not a ledger, it was a choreography. Architecture, earth-shaped to meaning. Carwatch's adobe platform stepped up from the plain like patient sentences, short clauses, long clauses, pauses where plazas opened to sky. Elsewhere, in Ventilla and La Muna, smaller mounds took shape, ritual benches, storage rooms, work patios where maize beer scented the afternoon. Adobe walls bore whitewash that caught moonlight, cane roofs breathed in the heat. Construction was communal, timed to seasons of slack labor, rising course by course as if a village exhaled and left bricks behind. When a building ended its life, they did not smash it to rubble. They filled it, carefully, ceremonially, and smoothed the surface until the land remembered its earlier silence. The architecture of addition, the architecture of closure. The workshop and the rule of the eye. Every craft had its discipline. Leather workers oiled their tools with good stoppered pots, woodcarvers scored bamboo with obsidian flakes, painters kept caches of brushes, hair-bound, reed-cut, each tip familiar as a friend. A young apprentice learned by watching, by doing, by being corrected without cruelty. A line had to be true, but truth here was not Euclid's alone, it was also the truth of myth, the truth of tradition. Hands learned rules that were also hymns. The tricks were practical, even when the results looked mystical. Stakes measured out the foundation of a glyph. A grid pricked into smooth clay held space a complex pattern before paint fixed it. A string, pulled taut, discovered straightness over uneven ground. Shadows were clocks. The horizon was a compass. You could teach this, you could pass it on. And they did. Feast and exchange. Ritual gatherings were markets of meaning. Envoys and families arrived with mats of woven goods, bundles of dyed yarn, sacks of beans, cords of dried fish, painted goods, mineral pigments in little leather pouches. In plazas you could hear the unmistakable chatter of barter, not adversarial, but skilled, a dance of equivalencies. A craftsman from the Aja Valley swapped a bridge-spouted jar for a length of feather-trimmed cloth, a fisher traded salt flesh for chili and cotton, a priest accepted pots marked for sacrifice and returned tokens of blessing and, sometimes, seed said to be lucky. Music rose and fell, children chased each other around the feet of elders, dogs slept under vendors' legs. Toward dusk, processions formed. The practical day ceded to the sacred night. You could not separate them neatly. The Naska did not try. Technology worn lightly. There was metallurgy, but it announced itself softly, hammered copper pins, gold foils pressed into nose ornaments, small discs stitched to cloth so that a dancer turned the sun into a garment. Stone still did most work, as blade, as weight, as memory. Bone kept time as flute or needle. Good and wood bridged kitchen and altar. The simplicity is deceptive. Simple materials do not mean simple minds. They mean an ethics, use what the land offers, refine it until it sings, and let it return when its song is done. The aesthetics of breath. Look closely at a Naska jar and you'll see a logic of space, fields arranged so figures never choke each other, color blocks placed to guide the eye, negative space treated like a second pigment. Painters knew when to leave a silence in a bitty sentence. Weavers understood when a band needed a thin line of contrast like a pulse. Musicians understood that one more drum would ruin the room. This restraint, this cultivated enough, is itself technology. A civilization's greatest invention might be its taste. Lines as the crown of craft. And over all this, above workshop, field, and puccio, the geoglyphs stretched, the crown of their craft. When you master color, you begin to master space. When you master space, you ask what the sky sees. The lines were the final experiment of a people who had trained their hands to steadiness, their eyes to proportion, their minds to pattern. Nothing about them is impossible once you grasp the culture that made them. Everything about them is miraculous even after you do. They were not created by specialists alone. Farmers could be drafted by faith into line-making, weavers might set down their yarn to hold a measuring cord, children might carry small stones to clear a path. The whole valley could walk a design into being. The whole valley could walk it again each season so that memory stayed bright. A network held together by meaning. Trade did not just move goods, it moved styles. A painter in the Tierras Blancas Valley adopted a neighbor's habit of thickening outlines and turned it into a school. A weaver in the Aja Valley learned a highland knot and found it ideal for a border of little stepping mountains. Knowledge traveled in baskets and in songs, winding along footpaths like slow, deliberate lightning. The art is varied because the culture was alive. And if you stood then at the edge of a field at dusk, panpipes thinning in the distance, smoke lowering itself over warm adobe, night birds cutting the last lines into the day, you would say, this is not a civilization of spectacle. This is a civilization of coherence. They knew that technology is not only tools. It is also agreements. Agreements about how to treat water, how to share ground, how to measure a straightness over an uneven world. How to see. This was their flowering, a season not of empire, but of mastery. Workshops, where technique became theology. In the cool shade of cane awnings, you could hear the grammar of craft, the soft rasp of burnishing stones over clay, the whisk of a reed brush laying a line so clean it felt inevitable, the dry clack of corded measuring stakes pulled from the earth and reset 2 handspans away. Apprentices moved like commas around their masters, finishing sentences of work that had begun generations earlier. Potters coiled jars from patient ropes of clay, smoothing the walls with gourd scrapers until surface and sky seemed equally unbroken. Slips were mixed in shallow basins, red from iron-rich earth, white from kaolin clays, black from reduced iron, each strained through cloth, each tested on a shard kept as a family lexicon of color. Before firing, the vessel's skin took its icon, a feline mask here, a band of serpent curls there, a little ladder motif stepping toward a rimline that stood for mountain, horizon, threshold. Master painters worked without rehearsal. The design lived in their hands. Kill crews tended heat with a musician's ear. They read flame by tone, dull orange meant patience, bright yellow meant danger, a sudden hiss from a vent meant an offering of fuel or a closing of bricks. When the firing finally fell quiet and the kill bricks lifted away, the workshop judged success by light, hold the jar to the morning, tilt, see whether the red glows like blood or like sun. Only then would a pot become a vessel for chicha or a gift for the platform's edge. Weavers kept different rules. Threads counted the world. Warp tension was a moral proposition. Weft carried story. Pattern looms were memory machines, encoding whole genealogies of motif, step diamonds for mountain rain, zigzags for river talk, little hooked frets like the tails of birds. In the finest mantles the backgrounds were not blank, they were fields of tiny, deliberate irregularities, the visual equivalent of breath. Perfection was not the goal. Harmony was. Feather artists stitched rainforest light into coastal air, bands of green heat, blue shade, yellow fruit, red call. A dancer in that mantle did not wear color so much as cause it. The quiet mathematics of the lines. In a culture where beauty and use were the same act, the geoglyphs were workshop scaled to land itself. The mathematics was unpretending, stakes set in pairs to define baselines, chords knotted to fixed lengths, right angles found by the triangle the hand remembers, 3, 4, 5 arcs pulled with a string around a pivot stone. Teams walked the measure and sang it to keep time. Where the ground pitched, they corrected with eye and cord, sacrificing no straightness to slope. From above, the monkey's spiral looks like a single thought. Up close, it is a choreography of decisions, each segment cleared to the same breadth, each curve reconciled to terrain, each junction checked against shadows at morning and evening. The miracle is not the scale, it is the steadiness. Trade as circulation of knowing. Goods moved because meanings moved. Caravans took the coastal valleys' cotton and color inland, and brought back obsidian that flaked to razors, shining hematite for polish, and copper hammered to thin plates that winked like domesticated sunlight. Salt and dried fish climbed toward frost lines. Llama wool and medicinal herbs came down to heat. Along the way, motifs leapt borders, a highland checkerboard found its way onto a Naska belt, a coastal bird learned to perch in a mountain pattern. Spondylus shells traveled farthest and spoke loudest. Their orange was the inside of rain. Priests did not wear them only, they showed them as arguments in ritual, as if to say, the far sea breathes here too. Traders told stories as they sold, stories were part of price. You could buy a jar, but you were also buying the path that brought it to you. Ports along the desert coast gathered reed craft each dawn, men striding into chop with nets curled on forearms. Inland plazas gathered at dusk with nets of a different kind, relationships thrown wide, kin and covenant cinched tighter with each exchange. In both places, success was measured by return. Foodways and the engineering of appetite. The table told you as much as any temple. Maize steamed in clay pots seamed with the fingerprints of yesterday, beans simmered slow with squash, chili and herbs turned the plain into fire carefully controlled. Anchovy and mussel, salted and sun-made, met guava and lucuma, coca leaves relieved the long day's edge. Chicha thickened talk, goods passed from hand to hand like agreements you could drink. Storage was technology in the long tents. Large jars half buried in cool floors kept grain calm through summer's anger. Dried peppers hung like little suns along adobe walls. Cottonseed was saved as carefully as myth, a bad year could not be allowed to end the story. Pukios and the ethics of maintenance. If the Pukios were miracles, their miracle lay in something unfashionable, maintenance. A society that can dig a tunnel is admirable, a society that chooses, year after year, to clean it, brace it, measure its grade, and apportion its waters is astonishing. The Naska invented a calendar of care. Dry season days devoted to clearing silt, communal labor feasts where work and eating were the same event, inspection rituals where elders and children walked the line and argued, kindly, seriously, about a stone's position. Law here was not a tablet, it was a habit, enforced by expectation and gratitude. Spiralfies were public architecture. They belonged to everyone and so to no one. If you descended one for the first time, the cool air rose like a blessing you had not yet earned. The sound, a low rush, steady as breath, taught humility better than sermons. Tools, measures, and the humility of enough. The toolkit was small, and that was the point. A cord with counted knots, not an account, but a reminder, a bone needle, the good scraper, an obsidian blade, a wood straightedge, a bundle of brushes. With them, they resolved problems that would swallow a warehouse of iron. Majesty worn lightly, you might call it, a technology that refused to dominate form and so never needed to apologize. Measures were human-scaled, finger, palm, forearm, pace. A platform course rose to the height of a knee because a knee is what you carry all day. A stair matched the rhythm of a breath. A jar's belly fit against a hip because hips are honest. Ritual economies, when the market is an altar. On festival days, exchange turned sacrament. Offerings to platform edges were also payments to the future. A jar given to the gods was a jar subtracted from personal wealth, and the subtraction itself was wealth of another kind. Economists would call it sunk cost, the Naska called it rightness. Craftspeople did not merely sell to ritual, they were summoned by it. A patterned mantle destined for a burial did not belong to the buyer or the maker, it belonged to the moment. When a pot was smashed on a platform in the dusk's last red, it made a sound that only the day could use. The shards went back to earth, the icon went into memory. Late innovations, subtle pivots. Even as climate shifted and highland neighbors pressed their silhouettes into coastal life, Naska craft bent, not broke. Painters thickened lines, palettes cooled slightly, figures grew more schematic. Weavers simplified borders but made cloth denser, as if preparing for travel. Potters experimented with larger storage forms, as if storing time. In the lines, new trapezoids sprawled wider, their open mouths seeming to drink horizon. Some pathways took on the feel of corridors rather than drawings, not images for gods, but avenues for people. Function and faith continued their long conversation without ever fully agreeing to be different things. Mastery, that astonished. Visitors to the valleys, highland traders, coastal fishers, messengers of neighbors we can only name by shards, all said the same thing in different words: these people make meaning with their hands. Not as prodigies, but as practitioners. Not as spectacle, but as standard. To watch a Naska painter lay a curve on a pot was to watch someone measure a breath and then keep it. To hear an ensemble of panpipes step into a plaza procession was to hear a village remember itself. In a world that worships height and noise, the Naska chose coherence and care. That choice, repeated for centuries across workshop and field, kill and puccio, path and plaza, is a technology too. Perhaps the most advanced. The bridge to the next truth. Craft shaped not only objects but people. Workshops sorted skill and status, irrigation schedules sorted obligation and mercy, exchange taught trust, ritual taught limits. Out of these choices, a social order crystallized: who led, who listened, who spoke for water, who danced for rain, who cut, who healed, who wore the mantle with feathers that said, "Today I am more than myself." From craft we arrive at caste, from tools to titles, from pattern to power. And so the flowering of Naska culture brings us to the bodies that carried it, the priests whose masks were weather and animal in one face, the artisans whose prestige sat in the steadiness of their line, the farmers in whose hands the valley rose each year, the captives whose heads bore a theology of return, the children dressed in first mantles to learn the difference between play and right. The objects have taught us what they could. To go further, we must step into the house of hierarchy and the field of faith, to see how people arranged themselves under the same sun, and how their gods arranged themselves under the same stars. Specialty hands, shared standards. Mastery that astonished thrives on rules that hold. In valley after valley the same quiet discipline appears, lip profiles on jars repeating within the width of a thumbnail, loom set band widths recurring like a heartbeat, feather borders cut to a constant depth so a dancer's turn throws light in even pulses. Workshops kept their own signatures, a painter's outline that swells just before it thins, a weaver's habit of doubling a selvage thread, yet across the region, forms agree as if the valleys had signed a treaty of taste. There were markers, too, discreet incisions beneath vessel bases, tiny punctures on the inside of a handle, a stitch color buried where only another craftsperson would notice. Not vanity marks, but messages to fellow hands. This was made to measure, This will fit your rack. This warp will meet your die. Standardization without bureaucracy, quality control as culture. The literal road, salt, reed, and horizon. To the west, the sea taught us second technology. On mornings when the desert's breath felt like still glass, fishers shouldered nets and slid taut or a reed craft into Pacific chop. These boats were nothing like Highland balsa rafts nor like the later Inca plank canoes. They were bundle-shaped to split surf, flexible enough to absorb waves, quick enough to dart home before the wind rose. Nets, weighted with smooth stones and rimmed with shell, scooped anchoveta that silvered the air with scale and sun. On shore, families salted and sun-cured the catch on cane racks, thin, portable, powerful food. In return for fish, caravans from the interior delivered cotton and chilies. Potters brought jars sized precisely to the carry of a reed boat stern. Priests sent painted goods for coastal shrines. At tidal edges, you could find small altars, shell, clay figure, a careful arrangement of stones, offerings to the borderland where fresh and salt, calm and storm, trade and prayer meet. Calendars of shadow. Astronomy at Naska was a craft among crafts. No bronze armillary spheres, no inscribed tablets, instead, gnomons planted in plazas, sightlines set to mountain notches, horizon markers whose meaning arrived twice a year with certainty. The solstice sunrise slid along a wall like a blade finding a sheath. Equinox light ran true through a doorway made for it and for nothing else. These were instruments of adobe and patience. Fields followed those shadows. Plant here when the gnomon's noon shadow fits the carved groove on the observation stone. Harvest when the sun enters the notch above the far ridge. Brew chicha for the platform when Venus reappears at dusk and returns the evening star to conversations. The sky was not a distant spectacle, it was a schedule written in light. Fermentation and fire, subtle technologies. Chicha, thick and luminous, was an engine of work and worship. Malting floors were smoothed and swept, dried in measured shade, wetted by ritual hands. Boiling pots took their turns like old actors who know the lines. Yeast is culture in more ways than one, and every settlement had its strain, vigorous, tart, sweet, stubborn, that made its beer taste like its river. Fired stones, heated outside and dropped into pots to raise temperatures quickly, saved fuel and made flavors. In kitchens and communal halls, you could hear the debate between slow heat and sudden boil, between a clean pot and one seasoned like a grandmother's proverb. Logistics of the impossible, that became routine. How do you make a hummingbird the length of a stadium? By treating the task like a canal or a crop. A planning ground first, a smoothed, smaller patch where a design could be pricked into earth by cords and pegs, with a grid scratched faintly and counted aloud. From there, foremen, elders of the line, really, scaled distances by rope knots. Crew captains set their people in parallel lanes, each lane the width of a shoulder plus a hand. Work moved in waves. Carry, clear, check, carry, clear, check. At halts, captains stood at fixed stakes and sighted along cords to make sure the straightness did not wander. When the ground rose into a loma, a crew trimmed the crest so that the visual width stayed constant from the baseline stake. At day's end, everyone walked the new cut in silence, then in song. Supply lines fed the effort, jars of water shaded in pits, reed baskets piled with roasted maize, gourds of chicha set at waypoints beneath cane screens. Children carried pebbles and watched the elders' hands. The line was not a project, it was a procession. Risk, failure, and how to learn. There were collapses, a Puccio tunnel roof gone to fatigue and time, a kill that fired off temperature and coughed out a cargo of dull slip and sorry faces, a terrace wall slumped by a rain that arrived a month early and stayed 2 days too long. Their response is the part that matters. Brace timbers and new stone linings, fuel recipes adjusted and venting patterns relayed like chess on hot bricks, terrace rehung with better drained stones, a wider spillway cut. They kept notebooks in their heads and on their hands. The valley learned. In the leanest years, ration jars came out, fat-bellied, round-shouldered, sized to the measure of a week for a family of 5. To draw down was to confess a season's truth without shame. No one learned to hide scarcity, they learned to survive it together. Guilds without walls. Say the word guild and you picture oaths and seals. Here, the guild was a way of watching. Potters noticed each other's firings and offered corrections like blessings. Your flame is too impatient, your slip would welcome a little more clay from the east bank. Weavers borrowed looms for a day to show an apprentice what even tension feels like in the shoulder and spine. Featherworkers kept aside a handful of impossible blue for a rival's right-day mantle. Competition lived, but it was not war, it was a dance where the best steps raised the floor for everyone. The late curve of the flower. As climate pressed and highland patterns thickened at the edges, Naska work pivoted rather than cracked. Granaries multiplied, cloth gained weight, pottery lost some polychrome complexity but gained scale and storage competence. The lines altered tone, fewer delicate figures, more broad plains and avenues like open mouths to the sky. This is not a fall, it is adaptation marked on clay and earth like tree rings. A culture writing in its own margins, announcing, we are changing on purpose. The ethics of enough. In all of it there is a restraint that reads like wisdom. No gold towers where water is short. No roaring portal when a spiral Puccio mouth can do the same work and teach the same lesson. Tools that fit the hand, buildings that fit the wind, art that fits the time it takes to make it well. When the world later arrived with its armies of height and glare, these valleys still whispered a harder achievement, coherence. The last lesson of the workshop. By now the pattern is clear, water work teaches schedule, schedule teaches authority, craft teaches rank, rank teaches responsibility, ritual trains attention, attention trains power. The workshop is already a parliament, the Puccio crew already a law. In the cool of courtyard shade you can hear hierarchy assembling itself out of errands and excellence, who speaks when the river runs thin, who holds the keys to the granary, who may lift the feather mantle, who may hold a blade that cuts ahead and calls it seed. From clay and thread, from line and song, a society steps forward, masked and named. The flower has opened. Now we must meet the gardeners and the gods. They arranged themselves the way they arranged their fields, in terraces, each course supporting the next, each stone laid to carry water and meaning down the slope without breaking. Power did not roar, it flowed. It had the shape of an irrigation channel and the voice of a priest. The people and their places. At the valley floor lived the farmers, their houses of cane and adobe clustered close to fields and canals. Dawn found them measuring water with shadows, hands in the soil, faces to the east. They fed everyone and so bore the first burden when the sky forgot to rain. Above them, in shade courtyards lined with pot stands and weaving frames, the artisans kept the valley's memory. Their status did not hinge on wealth alone but on steadiness, a line that never trembled, a warp that never wavered, a kill that did not lie. Prestige here was a craft you could point to. Overseeing both stood lineages of ritual specialists, priests and priestesses, diviners, healers, keepers of the gnomon and the calendar of shadow. They were not kings in the sense of iron and decree. They were custodians of schedules, when water moved, when seeds slept, when the first cut would be made in maize and in man. Around them gathered assistants, fire tenders, costume keepers, bearers of masks and rattles, an invisible scaffolding that made ceremonies look inevitable. There were warriors as well, though you would not always know them by a fortress or a wall. Their proof was on vessels and skin, clubs, slings, spear throwers, the cut of a blade that had learned from obsidian and bone. Some escorted caravans, some stood at valley thresholds when a drought turned a neighbor into a thief, some served the rites that braided blood into rain. Captives existed, so did servants by debt or birth. But even here, hierarchy spoke the language of obligation. A lord's right to command was also a duty to feed, to mend, to pour chicha first and last. Children watched from thresholds. Small hands learned to count on cord and to tie knots that meant days, debts, and promises. Girls learned the grammar of color, boys learned the angle at which a terrace stone neither slips nor sulks. Both learned the songs that calibrated a footstep to a procession and a heart to a crowd. The law of water. The first law in a desert is not do not steal. It is do not waste. Water had magistrates, elders who could read gradient by eye and remember the last 3 floods by the stains they left on stone. They presided at the mouths of pukios and at the branch stones where a main channel divided into community veins. Disputes did not end in shouted victory, they ended at a ledger of water measured in shadows and days. If you drew early, you returned late. If you broke a wall, you rebuilt too. The punishment for cheating was not pain but reputation, the kind that closes doors on market day and seats you alone at feast. Ritual underwrote law. At the start of the dry season, a procession wound along the main canal, pausing at each gate and spill. Priests lifted goods, poured libations, named the fields like kin. Children carried little jars and poured tiny shares, learning that water was not a thing but a relationship. The community read the canal like scripture. Masks, mantles, and authorized faces. Authority wore faces that could be put on and set down. In storage rooms at Kawachi and lesser platforms up valley, masks of wood and gourd, painted with feline jaws, beaks, and serpent eyes, waited on pegs like sleeping weather. A priest did not merely speak as himself, he borrowed a face. He borrowed voice from panpipes, patience from drum, sight from coca leaves. Mantles declared which god he carried, feather borders that flashed sea green for con, wind's messenger, stepped motifs for the mountain APU whose snows were distant rain stored as promise. When a ceremony opened, the office arrived before the person. Ropes were not counted, gourds arrayed, shells laid in speaking order. Then the mask lifted and the voice came through. A good priest could hold silence for a full minute and make it feel like rain about to begin. Households, moieties, and the art of balance. Each valley was a braid of households clustered into kin groups that shared terraces, tools, and ritual duties. Those braids paired into moieties, halves that danced the year's counterpoint, one responsible for certain months and rites, the other for their answering voice. Marriage often crossed the split, balancing land and labor. When a feast called both halves, banners faced each other across a plaza like riverbanks. Processions met at center, then parted, a choreography that taught children the grammar of difference without the habit of hatred. Healers, herb lore, and the open body. Medicine was an intimacy with plants and with pain. Healers tended gardens where mole shaded bitter leaves and mint argued with heat. San Pedro cactus grew at ritual edges, its spines like a doctrine of careful approach. In their baskets lay poultices for burns, leaves for fever, powders for infection, and seeds to calm a stomach after a long procession. Trepanation, a small round window cut into bone when pressure or spirits demanded it, carried the quiet courage of a people who believed the skull could reopen and close again with life inside. Healed edges on bone were a kind of boast. We cut, and you lived. The body was porous by design. Coca unlocked breath for effort and sight for trance. Chicha made talk possible between people and gods. Paints turned skin into statement, white for chill and air, red for earth and heart, black for water held in the ground, yellow for the knife edge of sun. Hair became cord became vow. Ritual, the year as architecture. A Naska year rose like adobe and shadow. Planting rites summoned patience from the river's sleep, first fruit feasts thanked before they ate, dry season ceremonies debated with the wind and asked it to relent. At Kawachi, multi-valley gatherings made the year feel brief and immense at once. Delegations entered by ordered paths, each bearing a portion of their world, mantles, pots, woven bands, the feathers of far places, shells that sounded like weather. On stepped platforms, priests arranged the brought world into meaning, then returned it changed. Music drew lines through air, antaras in harmonies of reed and bone, ranks of 7, 9, 11, their tunings built to step together and apart like the moieties below. Drums stitched time across plazas, rattles made weather while priests called weather. Nights ended in embers shaped meticulously so that morning would look back and see the map the dark had drawn. Blood and the seed, a theology of return. The trophy head is either scandal or scripture depending on who holds it. In Naska hands it read like an agricultural text. The head was not a spoil, it was a seed whose spirit fertilized soil and time. Ritual blades, crescents of stone and copper, were not knives of anger but of promise, lifted with words that placed death in the service of cycles. Some heads were enemy gifts, some may have been volunteered by those whose social death was already decided by illness, by oath, by a logic we have not fully learned to hear. Ceremonies did not hide the act. They framed it with masks, with song, with mantle and shell, so that it landed inside a story that could bear it. Afterwards, blood-spotted earth was carried to fields in baskets. Seed went in at that spot. Harvest, there was a story the whole valley watched together. Costume and the redistribution of glory. Prestige in Naska life was visible but loaned. A feather mantle belonged to its day and its office more than to the shoulder that wore it. After the rite, it returned to textile guardians. Shell and foil ornaments were distributed with meaning and then recollected, stitched back into storage cloths that rustled like rain when moved. Only small pieces went home, a narrow band, a painted good, a pendant that said you served. Glory circulated like water. Justice, shame, and repair. When wrongs were done, the plaza heard first. Elders and waterkeepers sat, accusers spoke, the accused answered. No tablets, but many witnesses. I saw him draw before shadow marked the stone. Her terrace wall fell because she skimped drained stone. He took a mantle that was on the platform's list. Penalties were repairs, rebuild the wall, carry water 2 seasons, bring 2 jars to the next rite, give the platform a pot with a painting that confesses what was done. Shame was short, repair was long, both were public. The sacred map, place as pantheon. The gods lived in geography. A specific bend in a river was a throat of con, a ridge was the feathered back of a mountain lord, a loma in the Pampa was a sleeping serpent head. Shrines were cairns and rings of stone, whitewashed walls that caught sunrise on a named day, trees spared from fuel because their shade had seen an omen once. To walk the valley was to read, this is where the flood turned good, this is where we found a spring, this is where we promised. The lines themselves were among these places, not pictures alone but agreements made visible. Gender, work, and the sharing of masks. Work was distributed as function, not as blunt rule. Women led loom rooms and dye pits, sometimes led songs, men cut terraces and carried heavy baskets, sometimes painted. Both poured libations. Both could serve as mask-bearers when lineage and training aligned. There were mantles woven for small shoulders and masks sized for narrow faces, rites of apprenticeship that made a child's first wearing a communal thrill. Old hands taught without humiliation, correction here was a kind of affection. Night councils and day orders. Decisions ripened at night. Councils sat on mats with gourds between them, coca leaf bowls within reach, and a panpipe's distant line stitching the dark. They spoke of water and work teams, of the next caravan and the next ceremony, of marriages that would strengthen slopes and songs that needed new verses. Dawn gave those decisions bodies, a roster chalked on a wall, a runner sent with a woven token to a cousin valley, a new stone laid on a terrace whose wall had seemed content but wasn't. The children of silence. They taught children to love quiet. Not the hush of fear, but the quiet that lets you see. In schools that were also households, a master asked a child to hold a string to a stake and look along it until the earth and the line agreed. Another child learned the weight at which a brush makes a perfect curve. A third learned to sit still while a gnome's shadow crawled to a notch. The curriculum was humility and attention. The diploma was a steady hand. Faith as practice, practice as faith. They had myths of con and condor, of sea and serpent, but belief was mostly practice. You believed what you repeated well: a canal cleaned, a loom warped, a pot fired, a line walked, a head lifted and named, a mask put away gently, exactly, for next time. Heresy was neglect. Orthodoxy was maintenance. Holiness was a terrace that did not fail a neighbor below. Pantheon in motion. They named forces, not persons. Con was wind and rain together, capricious, generous, a beaked spirit whose cloak was weather. The mountain lords, the Apis, were not statues but snow lines, each white rim above the far ridges a stored promise of water. The sea was a throat that could sing or swallow, its emblem was the killer whale with a grin like moonlight on teeth. Between these immensities moved messengers, birds whose flight stitched valley to sky, the serpents whose coils made rivers thinkable, felines whose paws were thunder. Priests did not tell myths, they wore them, masks that condensed a pantheon into a face you could understand for an hour. The gods did not live in palaces. They nested in places, an upthrust stone that caught the first light of solstice, a spring whose taste was sweeter after drought, a saddle on the skyline where constellations sat each year at the same dusk. To worship was to go there, on the day when shadow and intention matched. Offices, not thrones. Leadership was a braid of offices, each with its own mantle and mask. The water judges read gradients with their eyes and reputations with their silence. The calendar keepers tended gnomons and sky notches, they owned no land, but harvests bowed to their certainty. The platform wardens guarded costumes, rattles, shell trumpets, and the long lists of who had served and who had yet to serve. The bone doctors held obsidian and comfort in the same hands, their baskets smelled of crushed leaf and clean thread. None ruled alone. A priest who announced the wrong day for a rite would find his voice light as ash. A judge who favored kin at the canal head would feel it in feast invitations and marriage offerings. Authority was granular, specific, and constantly renewed by competence. The house and its horizon. A house was a promise, reed and adobe around a packed earth floor, storage jars nested like moons along a wall, a loom or two, a low table, a corner for good bowls and their spoons, a bundle of tools hung where children could stare at them and learn their shapes by heart. Household altars were small, a whitewashed niche with a shell and 2 stones, a feather tuck beside a good stopper, a bit of cloth that had once brushed a platform edge. Kin groups braided houses into terraces of labor. They shared drained stones and seed, turned walls after rains, and assigned night watch when a Puccio mouth felt nervy with strangers. When a child fell ill or a kill cracked too often, it was the braid that corrected fate. Someone fetched the bone doctor, someone else lent a better slip, a luckier firing pit. Fate here was not lonely. Marriage, debt, and the fabric of oath. Marriages crossed the valley's great halves so that water and work never knotted on one side. Shells and cloth moved between houses like slow lightning, a new loom beam crossed a threshold, a young man brought his best jar, painted with his lineage's boldest curve, and set it where both families could see it before the rite. Oaths were not words alone, they were bundles, a coil of cord knotted to count obligations, a small bag of seed, a good with a rim carved in the other lineage style. Debt could be paid in labor days, in jars painted for a platform, in reed and roof relayed after a storm. Oath-breakers did not disappear into dungeons. They appeared in plazas, bearing stones and tools, made visible by the work they owed and would deliver. Shame was a season, repair was a method. Divination and the grammar of sign. How did a priest know? He read coca leaves on a mantle laid flat, 3 overlapping greens that pointed like birds' beaks toward a choice. He listened to water at the spiral mouth, a change in timbre told of silt upstream or a collapsed timber in the dark. He studied a polished riverstone mirror for the way light broke on its face at dusk. He lifted shells and let them fall in a small ring of stones, read their mouths and the direction of their hinge. He watched birds. He watched mice. He watched people most of all, how a father set a jar down, whether a child's laugh frayed into worry around food. Divination did not force fate, it synchronized it. The answer was seldom yes or no, it was not yet, with them, after song. Purity, taboo, and the flow of power. Some days had edges. On the eve of a first fruit rite, no one cut hair, on the morning of a head-taking, no one ate fish. Masks did not touch bare ground, mantles never saw rain. Water from a puccio mouth could not be used to wash paint from hands, it was for fields and for throats. Blood, once given to the platform, could not be wiped with a household cloth, a special reed mat waited to take such stains and, later, be burned with words. Taboos were not fear, they were hydraulics, little gates that kept power from leaking the wrong way. Apprenticeship and the making of steady hands. Children entered craft by errands. Hold this cord. Watch the shadow. Listen to the kill. A first straight line on a pot's belly felt like joining a bloodline. Masters corrected by demonstration, redraw the curve slower, rewarp the loom with less pride and more patience, tie your hair back before you paint. Faults were catalogued gently, too much wrist, not enough shoulder, too much fuel too quickly, too many stories before the work is sure. At certain thresholds the village noticed, a first mantle worn by its maker, a first jar accepted for a platform, a first day a stakeholder on a new geoglyph lane. The child carried home not just applause, but new work. The ritual of passage. Birth, a cord knotted to mark the day, a smear of white clay on the mother's brow, a drop of chicha to the ground before the infant nursed. First hair cut, a ring of kin with little knives, a bowl to catch the strands, a story told about the valley's first terrace. Coming of age, a small mask tried on, briefly, in an empty room, a first coca leaf held and not chewed, a night on an adobe roof watching the Pleiades rise to their old place. Marriage we have seen. Elderhood arrived not with a feast but a privilege, to sit nearer the waterkeeper at canal council, to speak first on the matter of shade trees. Death returned a body to bundles. Cloth wrapped the person like law, layer on layer, with small jars, a panpipe, a tool or brush, a handful of seed. Graves were not deep, but they were exact. On the day after, work resumed publicly, grief moved into smaller rooms where it could name itself without breaking the valley's schedule. The procession as constitution. On the great days, the moieties assembled with banners. Antares began a long stare of notes. At the platform's base, each lineage offered a jar with its best hand, a mantle with its firmest pattern, a basket of seed saved from the best corner of a field, a shell that had traveled farther than anyone present. The platform wardens inspected and accepted, painting a small mark on a good list. Priests lifted masks to their faces and time changed, the way dust changes when the first star decides to be seen. A ritual had parts like a law, invocation, procession, offering, pronouncement, distribution. When the pronouncement came, water will be apportioned this way, terraces above the eastern bend will be mended first, the puccio at the lower mouth will be cleaned in 3 days, the lime making will begin after full moon, the crowd breathed once, together. Agreement was not unanimous, it was total. Dissent would happen later, inside work, where it could be useful. Captives, heads, and the covenant of renewal. Violence lived at the edges of the valley and at the edges of the calendar. Captives were not nameless, their names were learned and spoken. If a head was taken, it entered custody like a guest who had paid everything at the door. Its mouth was sewn shut, yes, to keep the breath from wasting itself. A cord through the skull's drilled hole was both handle and halo. The head's presence sanctified planting, its absence demanded explanation. Children were not made to watch, they were made to carry baskets of earth and seed afterward, to see the other half of the act. Silence as a civic skill. Silence was drilled like a muscle. It was the condition for seeing whether a line truly ran straight across a slope. It was the space in which a judge could hear water lie. It was the pause before a priest spoke, where the voice that came would not be merely his. In households, some tasks required song, others required quiet. Children learned which by watching the adult's face, by reading the set of shoulders, by feeling whether the air felt like loom or like gnomon. Iconography as policy. What they painted on pots they practiced in plazas. Two-headed serpents meant negotiation across difference, creatures with branch limbs meant roles that reach, farmer-priest, artisan-judge, warrior-bearer. The radiant figure with spread hands meant office, not ego. When a new policy was hard, a painter rehearsed it on clay, an irrigation split rendered as twin serpent necks, a merger of lineages as two birds sharing one body, a redistribution of labor as a ladder whose rungs thickened where work would be heaviest. The jar circulated before the decision did. By the time the council met, the village had already pictured it. Ancestors, not ghosts. The dead did not haunt, they advised. Their bundles were visited on certain nights with small cups and well-folded cloths. Stories were told facing the floor, not the ceiling, as if speaking to earth where listening is better. If a platform needed filling, the holy burial of a building, small tokens from ancestor bundles could be placed within its courses, a shard from a grandmother's favorite cup, a thread from a mantle whose dye never faded, a pebble from a field that never failed. Architecture became genealogy. The geography of mercy. Every valley had places for reconciliation, a shaded bend where water ran slow and cool, a small plaza with a tree whose birds never seemed to mind human arguments, a whitewashed wall that took the afternoon and made it gentle. Offenders met accusers there with intermediaries, often weavers, who have a professional hatred for knots that cannot be untied. Gifts were simple and precise: a spool of thread, a jar of beans, the promise of 2 days' work on a terrace, marked with a painted good. If agreement failed, the case advanced to the platform. If it succeeded, both sides poured a mouth of chicha to ground and went home lighter. Gendered power, shared sacred. Rights had roles. Some masks historically sat better on voices traditionally trained as male, some songs grew best in throats traditionally trained as female. But the sacred was not gated to one body. A girl who saw shadow as sure as any elder could become a calendar keeper's apprentice. A boy whose hands were born with warp patience could own a loom room by 30. The mantle did not ask your sex first, it asked your steadiness. And when a mask needed a lighter step, the platform warden knew which shoulders, regardless of lineage, made the god seem true. Law carved in days. When the sky's argument with the sea broke into flood or famine, the valley's constitution woke like a spine. Work teams rotated without panic, storage jars opened in order, elders' lists came out, who had given what, who had earned what claim. Aid was not charity, it was arithmetic remembered. You poured when my canal broke, I pour now. After, when normal days returned, gratitude took material form: a mantle border, a jar painted with your neighbor's style, a new drain in a wall that had never needed one before but now had earned it. Memory kept as work. In Naska valleys, remembering was not recitation, it was upkeep. To forget was to let a terrace slouch, a puccio choke, a mast crack in storage. Elders did not ask children to repeat dates, they asked them to point at a wall and say whether its stones were listening to one another. This is how a people becomes durable without becoming hard, by equating virtue with maintenance. Crisis as exam. When years went thin, winds cruel, rivers sulking, El Nino unraveling roads, the social machinery showed its teeth. Rotations to clean the puccios accelerated, ration jars opened in an agreed order, runners stitched valleys with news and need. Priests shortened ceremonies without hollowing them, like a singer removing ornament but keeping the song. Water judges slept less. Weavers added weight to cloth so nights bit less hard. No decree announced this, the moieties lowered their banners in the same breath and did what memory had already planned. Even so, thresholds exist. Scarcity tenses kinship. A neighbor who drew water early became not only a sinner but a threat. A caravan that did not arrive on time stopped being absent and began to smell like betrayal. At those edges, the plaza's voice took on another register, and offices acquired other masks. Signals and thresholds. From usual days to martial days, the transformation was precise. The same high lomas that held solstice markers bore small cairns where signal smoke could be read across valleys. The same runners who carried invitations to feast carried warnings, each not in accord, now standing for a valley's state, 2 for watch, 3 for muster. The panpipes that braided processions learned short, urgent calls. The feather mantle stayed folded, a different vestment came out, cane shields, quilted cotton that turned slings and darts aside, headbands died to say, ours, even when dust made all faces the same. A society that has practiced attention can practice defense. The civic mask comes off. Beneath the enamel of order lay the oldest human politics, border and bargain. The water law that had braided neighbors into obligation could, under stress, unbraid them into competitors. The same calendar that told when to sow could tell when to strike. And the same plaza where justice was repair could become the floor where spears clacked, where the war priest lifted a blade whose theology was seed and whose policy was deterrence. None of this contradicted belief. It completed it. The gods of rain and mountain ask for balance. When balance fails, they ask for courage. The doorway between worlds. So the Naska year had two doors. Through one, the people passed with mantles and gourds, and taras and libations, making treaties with water and the sky. Through the other, they passed with shields and slings, scouts on the ridges, runners in the draws, making treaties with neighbors and necessity. The same measured hands that painted a hummingbird could not accord that meant muster at dawn. The flower of culture had roots, the roots had stones. We have traced the petals and the sap and the gardener's patient rules. Now we must step out past the last terrace, into the difficult air where words like border, raid, truce, and tribute stand up. They did not love war. They learned it like they learned straightness, from need, with discipline, and without romance. The shape of a threat. In the Naska world, danger arrived in three costumes. First came scarcity, a season when the river ran too thin and the temptation to draw early outweighs shame. Second came neighbors, coastal rivals, up-valley cousins, highland bands testing a boundary while the Pukios slept. Third came the weather itself, flood-tearing terraces, and then, when fields were weak, strangers harvesting what remained. Policy began where geography said it must. Valleys are tunnels of green in a red country, borders are the ridges and the mouths of canals. Whoever held the canal head held a season. Arms that fit the land. Their armory was the deserts, slings braided from llama wool with pouches polished by stone, river pebbles chosen for weight and spin, carried in nets at the hip, spear throwers, atlatls, that turned a hunter's arm into a lever, darts tipped with stone and hardened wood, maces whose star knobs taught skulls humility, canes hardened by fire, shields woven of cane and lined with hide, light enough to run with, tough enough to turn a sling stone. Quilted cotton armor, layer on layer, heavy with wisdom, drank impact and turned blades. Reed boats served the literal skirmish, quick night landings against fish racks or salt pans, a warning more than a conquest. They knew ambush the way they knew irrigation, study slope, study shadow, place your people where the land already intends a narrowing. They used wind as ally, stones and dust driven into an enemy's eyes at the hour when the desert breathes hardest. Scouts learned the dialect of footprints. Signal smoke lifted with grammar, 1 column for watch, 2 for approach, 3 for muster, for flight to the second line. Muster, turning procession to army. A call went out. The moieties arrived not in feathers but in bands of cloth tied for the day. The platform wardens brought out war gear like another set of masks, shield bundles, sling pouches, the better stones kept for real need, the mantles of officers whose authority would last a week or a battle, whichever ended first. War leadership was a loan, not a crown, competence chosen by voice and memory. He reads ground, she hears ambush, he returns people alive. Before moving, they ate together as if for feast, afterward, they lifted a short right to remind the day it belonged to a story. Then they divided, fast feet to ridges, steady feet to canal heads, patient feet to storage jars and grandmother doorways. Defense is also logistics: guard the grain, scatter the animals, pull the canal gates, wet the ditch bed so a charge sinks ankle deep. Rules carried into dust. Ritual did not disappear, it condensed. No fighting on the platform steps. No burning of mantles or masks, memory must survive a quarrel. No fouling of pukio mouths, even enemies drink tomorrow. Captives were taken for exchange, for labor, for the theology of return, murder for anger's sake stained more than hands. Trophy heads had days and purposes. To take one outside those days was to make drought with your own fingers. The line between piety and policy was a thread they refused to cut. Diplomacy, markets that negotiate. War was rare because diplomacy was constant. Markets were peace talks with baskets. A quarrel over water could be cooled by a corridor of exchange, for llama loads of salt against 10 days of canal access, a marriage that braided moieties across a ridge, a promise of labor crews after flood. Plazas held assemblies where a water judge and a mask bearer sat side by side, behind them, weavers as witnesses, people trained to bind difference into strength. Feasting mattered, the host sets the grammar of generosity, the guest answers with grace or reveals himself as future problem. Chicha was poured like punctuation, shells set on mats like footnotes from the sea, panpipes argued a future where feet can move together again. Bordercraft. Boundaries were made visible with small arts, cairns on saddles, whitewashed stones along faint paths, little shrines that said, someone prays here and therefore someone owns here. Runners carried woven tokens that admitted them to draw water under treaty. When treaties broke, the token stayed, slow archaeology of promise. Watch huts on lomas doubled as sky notches, a keeper could read Venus in a doorway slit and also the dust of a caravan in a notch between hills. Politics, like astronomy, loved repetition and exception. A campaign in the dry. A remembered example moves like this. 2 valleys south, a river has failed twice, hungry men have drawn one night from a canal above the divide. Stones were left in the ditch to force a second try. At dawn, smoke on 3 lomas says watch. By noon, 2 moieties muster at the canal head, shields planted, slings ready. A runner returns, dust on the far saddle, 8, maybe 10. War leadership raises a hand, the Antaras cut a short message, the line folds back along a terrace like water along a bank, inviting a charge that will meet mud where the ditch bed has been wet all morning. When the enemy stumbles, slings speak in one voice. 1 falls, 2 drop shields, the rest turn. No pursuit beyond the cairn. A runner follows at distance to read intention, another runs to their elders with a good sealed in cord, come speak on our platform at dusk or command at dawn. They came at dusk. Terms, water on alternate days until the second flood, 30 hands to help mend the eastern terraces, 2 jars from their best kill to our platform, 1 marriage in the next seasons, our choice, their honor. Ahead? Not today. The theology of return can wait for a day that needs it. Agreement lands and is painted next morning on a pot that will travel between valleys, telling the story with birds that share a body and serpents whose necks cross but do not bite. High paths, highland pressure. From the uplands, other policies descended. Messengers in checkerboard cloth spoke of new ways of building, new calendars braided to imperial tastes, new tribute counted in days and jars. Naska valleys answered with courtesy and calculation. Alliance when it fed canals, resistance when it threatened autonomy. Some adopted highland forms, heavier jars, more rigid plans, to buy peace. Others retreated upside valleys and hid their best in storage caves. The flower bent with wind, roots keeping hold. Internal politics, prestige and its checks. Prestige wanted to become power, the society taught it manners. A painter whose hand everyone praised could not skip canal duty, a water judge who knew the river's moods could not take the first pour. Feast largesse worked as currency and as leash, give much, and you owe more. The platform wardens kept lists not only of offerings but of returns. The plaza remembered who buttered speeches with chicha and who buttered terraces with sweat. Office rotated across lineages, seldom repeating while memory was fresh. The community feared not strength but stickiness, power that clings. Their cure was work and witness. The last defense. If all else failed, if flood cut storage and a neighbor grew teeth, if the highland road darkened with strangers who did not understand the law of water, the valleys had one more strategy, to vanish correctly. Reed boats slid to sea by night, caravans took the high paths with children and seed, masks and mantles slept beneath adobe courses, Puccio mouths were choked carefully, stones stacked in a pattern only elders could read backward. The lines remained. A people that knows how to maintain knows how to leave and return. Politics in the lines. Even the geoglyphs carried policy. A new trapezoid cut broad near a contested border said, in the sky's grammar, we are here, together. A path widened into a court was both right and muster ground. A radiant figure's arms were not only prayer, they were signal. From the ridges, enemies could see the same words the gods could, this plain has a will. They did not leave a throne to inherit. They left a method. A way of joining sky to soil, neighbor to neighbor, day to day. Empires vanish, methods travel. After the muster, the memory. Wars end in distribution. When the musters broke and shields returned to bundles, the valleys resumed their first politics, water and work. But the drills of crisis left grooves in habit. Runners kept their routes even in peace. Signal cairns on the Lomas were refreshed after every storm whether danger pressed or not. Lists of obligations were copied from elder mouths into younger hands. The technology of response, rotations, storage, the courteous firmness of the water law became the curriculum of adulthood. Children learned it the way they learned the measure of a straight line. A people that survives by schedule turned survival into culture, and culture into export. Traces in neighbor tongues. Highland visitors, coastal traders, messengers from valleys 2 days north carried home more than jars and cloth. They carried the Naska habit of enough. A canal need not be grand if it is maintained. A ritual need not be long if it is exact. a line need not be carved in stone if the wind will guard it. In settlements far beyond the Rio Grande basin you can find drain stone set with a Naska patience, reed awnings angled for wind that arrives at a certain hour, nomads planted in the center of life rather than off to the priestly side. Influence rarely arrives with fanfare, it appears as the thing that has always been done that way. Style traveled too. Painters who never saw kawachi learn to thicken an outline just before it thins. Weavers who never touched a coastal loom learn to break a long band with a single thread of contrast like a breath between phrases. Antaras in distant plazas began to favor interval sets that climb, step, rest, the Naska cadence of procession encoded in sound. The law of water becomes a constitution. Elsewhere in the south coast, councils borrowed the Naska custom of public repair. The punishment for ruin was rebuilding, the apology for theft was work, forgiveness was measured in labor days. The prestige economy, glory loaned, not owned, mantles and masks as offices rather than property, softened the urge to accumulate, hardening instead the obligation to serve. Even when new hierarchies formed under highland pressures, the loaned mantle left a ghost rule behind, power should circulate with the seasons. When the flower bends. By the 5th century the climate's argument grew loud. Flood scoured terraces, drought bit through bark. Highland cities rose with new calendars and new geometries, and their shadows lengthened over the coast. In some valleys, Naska craft folded itself into those grids without breaking. Pottery palettes cooled, forms grew heavier, warehouse architecture learned right angles. But the old method, care over display, maintenance as morality, kept breathing under new plans. People moved. Up valley to narrower green. Side valley to springs the world had forgotten. The diaspora carried what counted, the way to survey a slope with a cord and a patient eye, the way to pass decisions through music before passing them through mouths, the discipline that never let a Puccio die if a body could still descend a spiral and lift a basket. The lines, meanwhile, remained where sky could keep reading. The plain that remembers. What is legacy, if not a place that behaves like a sentence you never stop finishing? The Pampa Colorada continued to host processions even as Kawachi went to sleep under deliberate earth. Descendants walked the old routes during years of trouble, then during years of joy, then simply because walking straight toward a horizon is a good way to remind a community that it still agrees. New trapezoids appeared, wider mouths, more avenue than image, a shift from picture to path that says, we are still convening. From certain low hills, you could still read them without wings. Not all figures are only for the gods. The condor's beak points away, the monkey's spiral holds you long enough to think. A shepherd's child on a ridge in a century that had forgotten the name Naska could still lift a hand and trace a hummingbird line in the air, smiling without knowing why. Memory keeps working even when language drops it. The Inca and the courtesy of recognition. Centuries later, roads arrived that laughed at slope and distance. The Inca stitched the Andes with stone and rule, countered labor with knotted cords that announced empire as efficiently as they recorded grain. They found the coast already disciplined. Where their messengers crossed Pampa lines, they did not plow them up. They stepped lightly. Perhaps because messengers know the dignity of a path, perhaps because the plane said, in geometry, I am already loyal to a higher order. A few Inca shrines align to old sightlines. Whether by intention or courtesy, the great empire laid its thread without untying the older weave beneath. Vanishing as an art. Then other winds. Ships on horizons that had never known sails like those. The coast learned a new grammar of command, a new calendar whose feasts ignored nomads and harvests. What survives such weather is what does not insist. Lines did not compete with pulpits, puquios did not argue with decrees. They continued to be useful, quiet, exact. A spiral still gave cool air, a canal still carried water, a straightness across a slope still taught the hand how to be steady. Many newcomers did not see the lines at all, they walked past while looking for gold. In that blindness lay salvation. The desert kept its sentences UN erased. Rediscovery, eyes borrowed from sky. Modernity taught people to fly, the Pampa taught them to look. A pilot's glance downward turned rumor into astonishment. What had been called roads by some and odd clearings by others became a script legible to air. Photographers traced, surveyors measured, and for a long while scholars argued across airstrips and dust. Calendar? Water map? Rights? All of it, perhaps, braided. A German mathematician, compass in hand, sun on hat brim, gave the plain years of her life and begged the world to step carefully. And the world, haltingly, learned to whisper again. Declarations followed. Lists were made that tried, inadequately, to carry the weight of a desert's grammar, protected, patrimony, heritage. Yet even protection is a negotiation. Tires bit where feet should walk, careless boots tore where wind had kept vigil for 2 millennia. Legacy is labor. The old lesson returned, maintain, or you will have nothing left to admire. The puquios keep breathing. Down in the spirals, where dust falls in slow columns and the air is cool enough to make a child laugh, the old aqueducts still flow. Some have been repaired with cement and new timbers, others keep their hard, exact stone. A farmer in a century that loves engines descends with a bucket and a grin, and the spiral answers with a wind that smells faintly of root and thyme. Utility is the best politics of memory. A culture that left us a way to drink leaves us something you cannot lock in a case. Museums, markets, and the shadow of a line. In towns built nearer to pavement than puquios, painted replicas of vessels sit in shop windows, hummingbirds and monkeys fly across woven belts for visitors to carry home, school children sketch spiders on graph paper and then on sand. Symbols travel according to whatever vehicles a century offers, postcards, coins, aircraft tails, company logos that want to borrow dignity from geometry. The risk is shallow use. The answer is depth of teaching, to pair a souvenir with a story, to say not only look but listen. In museums, true pieces sit under glass, their colors both louder and more subtle than reproductions guess. A guard leans in while a visitor stares and murmurs what the caption cannot hold, how the slip was laid, how the line was pulled, how the field behind the god matters as much as the god. The old method still requires a human voice. Science bends to ritual, and back. Scholars learn to cooperate with shamans who learn to cooperate with scholars. Astronomers measured azimuths and precession, elders measured habit and harvest. Hydrologists mapped aquifers, farmers told them which spirals sing in January and which sing in June. DNA answered questions about migration, weavers answered questions about motif that DNA could never hear. The best arguments ended in feast. Calendar, water, right, root stopped competing and started braiding. The plane approves of braids. Art that teaches engineers, engineering that teaches artists. Architects sketch trapezoids into plazas far away from Peru, learning once more how a narrowing space can invite rather than command. Landscape designers copy a spiral not for pastiche but to move air where air is lazy. Musicians build new antaras and discover that certain old intervals persuade feet to agree. Painters try the Naska rule, enough, not more, and discover composition's old secret, leave a silence so the bright can speak. Students of civil works hear about puccios and ask better questions about maintenance. What does it take to keep it alive? Becomes as sexy as how high can we build? The desert smiles. The ethics of enough. Perhaps the truest legacy is a refusal to worship excess. The Naska chose coherence over spectacle, they chose repair over rupture, they chose offices that return to pegs after wearing. In an age that measures triumph by height and glare, their lines whisper an alternate metric, the tension, maintenance, alignment. You inherit an empire by force, you inherit a method by imitation and gratitude. Modern communities, thirsty and crowded, learn to schedule water without making it a weapon. Markets relearn how to be treaties. Rituals relearn how to be short and sufficient instead of long and loud. The long view. Stand again at dusk on the edge of the Pampa. The air cools in a way that never gets old. A truck sound in the far distance fades, wind rehearses its one note across the gravel. You can see what the gods saw, or what the people hoped the gods would see. Straightness across irregularity. Curves that refuse panic. A patience you can walk. Legacy is this, a system of attention that anyone can still practice. Children who learn to plant a gnomon and read its shadow become heirs, a community that cleans a channel becomes a dynasty. The great figures, monkey, hummingbird, spider, are not just images. They are verbs, to coil, to sip, to wait. What remains after us? Someday our own height and glare will dim. Some of our phrases will be legible only from machines no one will run. What will survive of us that asks for nothing and gives everything it has? Perhaps a line across a slope, kept clear, perhaps a spiral that breathes, perhaps a habit of pouring first to the ground before we drink. The Naska did not command the future. They invited it. They made a desert into a legible promise and left it where time could not easily erase it. The last image. A child kneels at the edge of a spiral and lets the cool air lift her hair. She has been taught how to walk on the Pampa, where, when, how slowly. In her pocket is a little reed, cut and polished by a grandfather who once helped replace a timber in a tunnel. She will learn to play it, she will learn to hold a brush, she will learn to hold a cord to a stake and wait until the earth and the line agree.